Welcome back. We're almost there. One more left to go and we'll make it through. So like we mentioned in the last video, we went over the anatomy, we went over the normal physiology. Now let's talk about what factors contribute to the normal physiology and what would we do if we wanted to alter that. So the way this section is going to work is I'm going to go through and kind of walk through definitional terms. And then at the end of the chapter, I encourage you to go back to D2L and download this document. It's going to be called the MA mean arterial blood pressure chart, and it'll be found in chapter 20 lecture notes. And you can download just this individual picture and then follow along with another video that walks through all of these definitional terms put together and how they all correlate to one another. So I would highly encourage you doing that. Very much 130,000% encourage you to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. So what does this flowchart even mean, and why do we care? So in order to determine how good the heart is at doing what it needs to do, we can actually measure that in terms of blood pressure. And blood pressure is a complicated thing because blood pressure is affected by multiple different components. And we've been able to isolate those components into two different things, one being cardiac output and the other being total peripheral resistance, or TPR. Total peripheral resistance we'll discuss in chapter 21, so we won't really talk about that here. But in this chapter, we're going to talk about cardiac output, since this is talking about the talking about the heart function itself. And so we can measure cardiac output by measuring heart rate times stroke volume. And remember, we talked about heart rate being the amount of beats per minute, and we talked about stroke volume being the amount of blood actually being ejected out in one contraction. So we can measure stroke volume by finding the end diastolic volume, or EDV, and subtracting end systolic volume from that value. So if we were to write that out, we could say stroke volume equals the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. And you're like, end, right? Like, wouldn't it end at 0? No. So remember how in this graph, we talked about how there's still some residual pressure just because there's still leftover blood at any given time in the ventricle. It's not always 0. This is normal. This is how it's supposed to be. It's totally fine like that. You don't want too much, you don't want too little, you want just the right amount. So the end diastolic volume, this is going to be the amount of blood left over after relaxation. And then end systolic volume, this is the amount of blood left over after a contraction. So where do you think that would be in this graph if we wanted to measure it along the x-axis, if we wanted to measure stroke volume? Well, we could put EDV along this time point, EDV, and we could put ESV along this time point, ESV. So then that way, if we take EDV and we subtract ESV from that distance, we will get this distance, right? And that will be the amount of stroke volume that was ejected. So end diastolic volume, if you don't believe me that is where that needs to go. End diastolic volume, the amount of blood left over after relaxation. So at this point in time, right? At this point in time, we have the AV valves. They are open and they're ready to restart the process, right? And if they're open, that means the heart is relaxed. So how much blood is left over in the ventricle after relaxation? Versus end systolic volume, right? At this point, we have the AV valves snap shut and we're just about to initiate a contraction of the ventricles. And after we initiate that contraction of the ventricles, then we finally build up. And just at the end of all of that pressure building up, we initiate a contraction and we push that blood out. So that's going to be our end systolic volume. Okay. All right. Ejection fraction we talked about and how that is this volume, right, or this value right here. And this is going to be the percent of the end diastolic volume that's actually ejected out during a ventricular contraction. We'll talk about individually the difference in heart rate factors and the difference in stroke volume factors. And some of that will also be re-reviewed, and all of that will be re-reviewed in the summary video for this picture or this chart that you can download on the right. So let's talk about heart rate factors. First, we have cardiac centers. And these cardiac centers are going to be found in the brainstem, in the medulla oblongata. And we know that they're in the medulla oblongata because if you remember from 201, the medulla oblongata is in charge of resting heart rate, and among other things as well. And we're going to have these cardiac centers send fibers down to the heart itself to tell it what to do. And those centers, we have two different centers. We have one that's acceleratory and one that's inhibitory. So the cardioacceleratory center, that's going to stimulate sympathetic neurons, which makes sense. If we're accelerating things, that's probably going to be sympathetics. Okay, cool. So what do you think that would do to heart rate? Well, that would probably increase heart rate, right? We stimulate sympathetics, fight or flight, increase heart rate, increase blood flow. The cardioinhibitory centers are going to do the opposite. They're going to stimulate the parasympathetic neurons, the rest and digest neurons, and that's going to decrease heart rate. So at any given time, both of these centers are going to be firing, but one is going to be firing a little bit more than the other, so then that way we actually have some sort of heart rate. If they were firing at the exact same rate, it would be 0 and we would be dead and there would be no heart rate. So these are always firing at some amount, but it's just a matter of which one is outcompeting the other in order for the heart rate to be fast or slow. Other things that contribute to heart rate include the vagus cranial nerve 10, which I mentioned in previous videos. This is going to be directly synapsing on the SA node. We also need to understand that sympathetics are almost always going to outweigh parasympathetics in the heart. And this makes sense, right? Because if we are quote unquote designed, let's say, so that we have an extra reserve for parasympathetics, but we don't have like an extra cranial nerve or an extra nerve for that matter coming to the SA node and providing sympathetics, then we can kind of like extrapolate that the heart is always kind of in sympathetic, kind of like in a fight or flight response. And it's up to the parasympathetics to kind of slow that down if we need to, for whatever reason. So it's much easier. So what I'm saying is it's much easier to speed up the heart rate than it is to slow it down. And in order to slow it down, you have to stimulate more of the cardioinhibitory centers, or you have to turn on vagus in order for the SA node to fire less. Both sympathetics and parasympathetics innervate the SA and the AV nodes, but like I said, we have additional parasympathetics going to the SA node. And like we mentioned before, the SA node is what's establishing the resting heart rate, or as our pacemaker cells. Here's a nice picture of what's going on visually. So up top we can see the medulla oblongata, and we can see cranial nerve 10 actually leaving from the medulla oblongata. This makes sense if you remember where the cranial nerves are in relation to the rest of the brainstem. This is exactly where they come off of. If we were to look at a cross-section within the brainstem, we could see cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitory centers bilaterally to service both sides of the heart, both cranial nerves. And we're going to ignore the cranial nerves for a second, and we're going to focus on the medulla oblongata and how it sends that information down to the heart. So the medulla oblongata is part of the brainstem. Brainstem turns into the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord we have gray and white matter. So we're going to have these this circuit that specifically goes from these centers through to the ventral horns of the spinal cord, out through the commissures along the thoracic vertebrae. And right there is where we have our autonomic nervous system come off of. And our autonomic nervous system is going to provide both sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation. And the autonomics only exist in the thoracic portion. If everything that I just said is like, wow, that's a foreign language, you need to go back to chapter, whatever the nervous system chapter is, and go over the sympathetics and parasympathetics. Okay, so we come out of those rami, we go into the roots, and then from the roots, then we stimulate directly the SA node and the AV node, respectively. And then you can also see where cranial nerve actually goes and directly touches the SA node. Okay, additional heart rate factors. So we also have reflexes. Reflexes are going to come from two different types of receptors. One is baro, one is chemo. The baroreceptors respond to pressure, changes in pressure. And then the chemoreceptors are going to respond to changes in blood composition. So things like dissolved O2, but primarily dissolved CO2. The baroreceptors changing to blood pressure. Where would we think that these would be? Well, where we would expect a bunch of changes in blood pressure. So we actually have these in a couple of areas. One is going to be in the right next to the aorta, and the other one is actually going to be in the carotids, in the carotid arteries in the neck. We also have some chemoreceptors, and the chemoreceptors are going to be in areas that we can actually register the difference in blood plasma in the blood composition. And one of the main chemoreceptors is actually sitting along the brainstem. And this makes sense because if it's sitting right along the brainstem, then it can immediately tell the brainstem, hey, we need to pump faster, we need to pump a little slower. And since it's next to the brainstem, it can also tell the lungs to breathe faster or slower too. These reflexes are innervated by cranial nerves 9 and 10 as well, so glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. We're not going to expect you to know glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve in this sense, but we are expecting you to know that cranial nerve 10 is providing parasympathetics to the SA node. Here's an example of what those pacemaker cells look like when they're firing. And on the left is what normal looks like, but when you add parasympathetic stimulation, which is what's shown on the right, we can see that we have much more distance in between each action potential. In between each action potential. If we add sympathetics, then we have much faster action potentials, one after another. Another thing that can affect heart rate is venous return. Venous return is the amount of venous blood that gets sent back to the heart. So this is every single red blood cell that doesn't have any hemoglobin or has done its job and deposited O2 where it needs to go and is coming back to the heart. All of those red blood cells is what composes venous return. And why would that even matter? Why would that affect heart rate, right? Well, all of this blood has to eventually come back into the right atrium at some point. And so if there's a lot of that blood coming into the right atrium, you can imagine the right atrium is like, whoa, that's a lot, and overstretches and needs to compensate. Conversely, if not enough blood is coming into the atrium at any time from this venous return, then the heart is like, we don't have enough blood to be pumping. I'll pump a little slower so we have a little bit more time to fill the atria so that we have more blood passing with every contraction, because I don't want to, there's no point in me working this hard if there's not enough blood for me to move around. So venous return is directly going to lead to an increased stretch in the right atrium. And like I said, the right atrium is also going to have those baroreceptors in the auricles, and that's going to increase SA node firing activity, because if there's more blood coming into the right atrium, the heart is going to say, whoa, I need to push this blood quicker, and thus I'm going to contract more often so that I can push more blood through. We call this the Bainbridge atrial reflex, where the right atrium wall stretches. This increases sympathetics and thus increases heart rate. Thus you increase blood pressure because you're moving blood a little bit faster. Some hormones also affect heart rate, things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and thyroid hormone. We'll talk about thyroid hormone in the next module. But epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're different by a couple of bonds. They're not that different chemically. But these all collectively and individually can increase SA node firing activity. Okay, so now let's talk about stroke volume, right? So cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So we talked about factors that affect heart rate. Let's talk about factors that affect stroke volume. And whenever we talk about stroke volume, remember stroke volume is this equation, EDV minus ESV. So we can talk about separate factors that affect both of these. So let's start with factors that affect EDV. And factors that are going to affect EDV, just to remember what EDV is, this is the amount of blood in the ventricle at the end of diastole, and ESV is the amount of blood left over at the end of systole. So we can talk about each of these individual factors and what affects them. So in EDV, the only thing that's really going to affect the end diastolic volume is the amount of blood that was ever involved in the first place. So we call this preload on the heart. So the amount of blood that was ever involved in a single contraction that would even potentially contribute to stroke volume is going to be called preload. And preload has two things that can affect it: venous return, which we already talked about, and filling time. So filling time is kind of tricky because you have to kind of think of this, step by step. You can't just jump into this. So if you increase the amount of filling time to fill the heart, are you going to get more or less blood moving in and out of it? Right? If you increase the filling time, you're going to get more blood moving through, and therefore you're going to increase EDV, right? But if you decrease filling time, that means you're going to have less time to fill the heart, so less blood is there, so you have less of an EDV, which means you have less stroke volume, right? Okay, so preload also affects ESV. and systolic volume, right? Because preload is the amount of blood involved before the contraction. And so just like preload can affect EDV and filling time affects preload in EDV, filling time affects preload in ESV as well. So the amount of time it actually took to fill the ventricles will also affect how much volume is left at the end, right? So after systole and after diastole. But venous return doesn't fit here because venous return is going to be the amount of blood that's in there during the relaxation phase, but after systole, we've already ejected all of the amount of blood that's there, so venous return doesn't exactly quite fit for ESV, but it only fits for EDV. Two other things that affect ESV are afterload and contractility. Afterload is the amount of pressure that the blood contributes to the heart after a contraction. And things that can affect this are kind of peripheral. They don't really have to deal with the heart itself. And that includes vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So this is vasoconstriction of the arteries and veins in the systemic circuit, and vasodilation of the same. So if we vasoconstrict the arteries in the systemic circuit, are we going to increase the afterload? Yes, because the amount of pressure now that the heart has to pump against whenever it's pushing blood out to the rest of the body is going to be greater because we were constricting all those arteries. We're not allowing for enough room to push all that blood out. And then the opposite will be true for vasodilation. Last but not least, we have contractility. And like I mentioned, contractility is the slope of this line at the point of which the semilunar valve closes. And this can determine how, I don't want to say how efficient the heart is, but it contributes to the efficiency of the heart. But how hard and how fast is it really working is what contractility is measuring. And we could affect contractility by sympathetics and parasympathetics. So if we increase sympathetics, we increase contractility. If we increase parasympathetics, we decrease contractility. We can also affect contractility with epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroid hormone, and glucagon as well. This is the picture that your book gives you to talk about the individual effects that affect EDV and ESV. And it tells you what factors affect preload, like venous time and filling time, and then what factors affect contractility, and what factors affect afterload, and how all three of those either affect end-systolic volume or end-systolic volume, respectively. So now, I like this chart. I think it does a good job of explaining what's going on from top to bottom. But if this doesn't make sense to you and you want a full, complete picture, then again, download that mean arterial blood pressure explained flow chart, and I'll walk through all of this again with a little bit more in detail and more examples. Okay, additional stroke volume factors for EDV. So an increase in EDV, right, if we increase this side of the equation, that means we're going to increase stroke volume, right? Like if EDV, I'm just going to say arbitrary numbers, right, is 5 and ESV is 2, and all of a sudden, and that would have equaled 3, right? But then all of a sudden we increase EDV to 7 and keep this at 2. Well, now 3 has increased to 5. So we can increase EDV, and when we increase EDV, then we're increasing stroke volume. So what does that kind of look like in a graph? And we can see that on the right-hand side with our pressure-volume relationship curve. Remember, stroke volume is the width of the curve, so from EDV on the right to ESV on the left, and we can actually measure the area of the curve to figure out how much of that blood is actually in existence. And factors that can contribute to EDV are venous return and filling time, right? That affects preload. So if we increase preload, we actually move the graph a little, or we move EDV to the right. And when we increase EDV, then we're increasing stroke volume. So you can see that the normal, the control is in black, and then the increase in stroke volume, the increase in preload is in red. The bigger the EDV and the larger the stroke volume, this is going to lead to even more stretching. But over a period of time, the heart can't do this like in long term, right? It can do it in the short term, right? Like if you're running a marathon or you're doing a workout or you're on a walk or you're on a run or whatever, right? In the short term, we can handle this extra amount of blood coming in to the heart and push it out. But in the long term, this just isn't sustainable and the muscle cells can't adapt to that. And so instead they reshape themselves and they end up actually getting thinner and less able to snap back, and therefore less able to contract as well. And when they stretch past their optimal length, then they start to lose their contractility. And this is kind of where this is what Frank Starling's principle is. And that's how he was able to represent all of this, was in the pressure volume relationship curve that we've drawn out. Factors that affect ESV, which we kind of already mentioned, but preload, so the degree of stretch in the ventricle, and then we talked about afterload and contractility. Here's some definitional terms of what, we already mentioned this, so I'll just keep going. Oh, here we can talk about factors that affect contractility. So we talked about how sympathetics and parasympathetics affect contractility. So sympathetics are going to be affected by norepinephrine and epinephrine, and parasympathetics are going to be affected by acetylcholine. And, parasympathetics can be represented by a release of acetylcholine. Sympathetics can be represented by a release of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So this is going to be the amount of force that's produced during a contraction. So if you increase the amount of sympathetics that go to the heart to increase the contractility, you're going to increase the amount of contractility in the heart. And if you're increasing the amount of contractility, then you're going to decrease the amount of end systolic volume available, which eventually is going to increase the systolic volume. The opposite is also true. If you increase parasympathetics, so you have more acetylcholine being released, now you have less contractility of the heart, so the heart isn't as good at pumping the blood out as it could be. So you're going to decrease the end systolic volume, and if you're decreasing the end systolic volume, then you're increasing the stroke volume that we're working with. Again, here's the picture that your book is giving you, but this time it's showing you not in detail, but just an overall arching view of what's going on for factors that are affecting heart rate and factors that are affecting stroke volume, and how you can measure each of these. And so, like I said, I go through all of this again with the video that runs through the flow chart that I encourage you to download in D2L. So this is a flow chart that is how I based my flow chart off of. This is from the interwebs. And on the left-hand side is everything that we cover in this chapter and how it affects cardiac output and thus affects blood pressure. Everything boxed in red on the right is going to affect total peripheral resistance, and we'll talk about that in chapter 21, and we'll add this information to our table in chapter 21. But if you want to watch a video that encompasses both halves of this flow chart, then definitely look on D2L for the mean arterial blood pressure graph and the video that corresponds to that. One last piece about cardiac output is something called cardiac reserve. So if we have the maximal amount of cardiac output minus the resting cardiac output, that is what would equate as our cardiac reserve. And cardiac reserve I don't want to say determines like health, but if you have better cardiac reserve, if you have a higher cardiac reserve, then your heart is better at being able to move blood through than the normal person would be. Because if you have a maximal cardiac output, right, this is going to be the heart having the greatest amount of stroke volume and the greatest amount of heart rate. Or I guess I should say and or. And then for resting cardiac output, hopefully resting cardiac output isn't very high. It should be low, because that means that the heart is just as good at moving the same amount of blood, but just doesn't have to pump it as hard or as frequently. And if you don't believe me, go and find a runner that you know that runs consistently or maybe ran in high school or in college, and measure their blood pressure and measure their heart rate and at rest and after jogging. At rest, it should be much lower than the average, so probably between the 60s and 70s for the heart rate, versus average is like between 70 and 85. And then blood pressure, I mean, that's kind of depends on the person and what else is going on, but heart rate you can definitely measure. And then when they're running, it's probably going to be a lot greater than what an average person's maximal cardiac output would be. So anyway, we don't expect you to be able to calculate this. We just expect you to understand what cardiac reserve is definitionally. At the end of this chapter, we also have some identification pictures here. This is just meant for help and for practice. You can love them, hate them, use them, not use them, whatever you'd like. And then extra resources I always list at the end here will include, I already included some crash course videos in D2L, the unlabeled images here, and then following we have some review questions in case you'd like to use these as well. But all optional, totally up to you and whatever you need. That's the end for chapter 20. I'll see you again for chapter 21.